Welcome, dear friends, to another long night's journey into the heart of history. Tonight, our story begins with a queen whose name alone conjures images of mystery, power, and passion. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. For more than 2,000 years, she has lived in the imagination of poets, painters, and playwrights. To some, she was the most beautiful woman in the world, a temptress who toppled mighty men with her charms. To others, she was a brilliant strategist, a ruler of intellect and vision, who stood against the tide of empire until the very end. Which was she, seductress or genius? That is the question we will explore together across this long story. And by the time the night is over, perhaps you will see her not only as myth, but as a woman of flesh, ambition, and extraordinary will. If you find peace in wandering through history, if you enjoy settling into stories that carry you across centuries, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. Not because you must, but because it keeps this little circle of history lovers alive. And I would love to know where you are listening from and what time it is for you. There is something quietly magical about imagining people across the world drifting into the same story, under different stars at the same time. So dim the lights. Let your imagination be the fire that warms the room. And let us begin, not with Cleopatra herself, but with the land and dynasty that made her, and the storm she was destined to face. Egypt before Cleopatra. By the time Cleopatra was born in 69 before Christ, Egypt was already ancient. The pyramids at Giza, those timeless mountains of stone, had been standing for over 2,000 years. The temples of Karnak and Luxor, with their towering columns carved with hieroglyphs, belonged to dynasties long vanished into dust. Egypt's gods, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, still had their priests and rituals, but they were the echoes of a civilization that had already seen its peak. In truth, Cleopatra's Egypt was not the Egypt of the great pharaohs. It was Egypt under the Ptolemies, a dynasty of Macedonian Greeks who had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. Their ancestor, Ptolemy I, was a general of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 before Christ, his empire fractured, and Ptolemy seized Egypt for himself. He declared himself pharaoh, adopted the rituals of the old religion, and founded a line of kings and queens that would last until Cleopatra. But the Ptolemies were not native Egyptians. They were outsiders ruling a land with a history far older than their own. Their language was Greek, their court filled with Hellenistic culture, their statues carved in Greek style. Though they presented themselves as pharaohs to the people, in truth they were foreign monarchs balancing 2 worlds, Greek in their palaces, Egyptian in their temples. Over the centuries, the Ptolemies grew weaker. Brothers and sisters married one another, as was their custom, but this led to deadly rivalries as much as dynastic purity. Civil wars tore the kingdom apart. Their treasury shrank as Rome's influence grew. The Nile still gave life to the land, but the throne of Egypt was fragile. The shadow of Rome. By Cleopatra's time, Rome was no longer just another Mediterranean power. It was the Mediterranean power. Its legions marched from Spain to Asia. Its fleets commanded the seas, and its politicians were hungry for grain, gold, and glory. Egypt was especially prized, for its fertile Nile Valley produced grain enough to feed millions. To Rome, Egypt was both exotic prize and practical necessity. The Ptolemies knew this. They maintained their thrones not only through ceremony, but through careful alliances with Roman generals and senators. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, known unkindly as Auletes, the flute player, was infamous for his dependence on Roman support. He emptied Egypt's coffers, bribing Roman politicians, ensuring that whenever his throne was threatened, Rome would intervene. To the Egyptian people, this dependence was shameful, but it kept the dynasty alive. And so, when Cleopatra was born, she entered a world where Egypt was ancient yet vulnerable, proud yet indebted, sovereign yet overshadowed. She would inherit not only the crown of Pharaoh, but also the precarious task of balancing her kingdom's survival against the ambitions of Rome. Alexandria, the jewel of the Nile. To understand Cleopatra, one must understand Alexandria, the city where she was born and raised. Founded by Alexander the Great himself, Alexandria was the capital of the Ptolemies, a city unlike any other in the world. Imagine marble palaces shining in the Mediterranean sun, wide boulevards lined with statues, and a harbor filled with ships from every corner of the known world. At its heart stood the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, its flame guiding sailors for miles across the sea. Within its walls was the great library, a treasure of knowledge, said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, histories, poems, scientific treatises gathered from across the world. Scholars, poets, and philosophers filled its halls, making Alexandria the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic age. But Alexandria was also a city of contrasts. Greek settlers lived in luxury, while native Egyptians often labored in poverty. Markets bustled with spices, silk, and ivory, but whispers of unrest lingered in alleyways. It was here that Cleopatra grew up, a child not only of palaces, but of a city that embodied both brilliance and tension, learning early that wealth and danger often lived side by side. The Last Pharaoh. Why is Cleopatra remembered as the last pharaoh? The answer lies not only in her death, but in her role as the final sovereign ruler of an independent Egypt. After her, Egypt would be ruled by Roman governors, its wealth absorbed into Augustus's empire, its culture reduced to curiosity rather than power. Cleopatra knew this possibility all too well. From the start, she faced the challenge of ruling a kingdom that was already, in many ways, under siege. She would not merely sit upon the throne as a passive queen. She would fight to preserve Egypt's sovereignty, to wield her wit and charm as weapons as sharp as any sword. She would speak to her people in their own language, the first Ptolemy in centuries to do so. She would align herself with the goddess Isis, becoming for her people not only a monarch, but a living deity. And she would step into the storm of Roman politics, entwining her fate with men whose names still echo: Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian, who would become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The question. So, as we begin, let us hold the question close. Who was Cleopatra? Was she the femme fatale of Roman propaganda, a temptress whose beauty toppled men? Or was she a master of survival, a ruler who wielded intellect, strategy, and diplomacy to protect her kingdom against overwhelming odds? Her story, as we will see, is not simple. It is filled with triumph and tragedy, love and betrayal, grandeur and ruin. But at its heart lies a woman who refused to be forgotten. And now let us turn to Cleopatra herself, not yet the queen of legend, but a child in the palace of Alexandria, the daughter of a troubled king, watching, listening, preparing for the destiny that awaited her. Cleopatra entered the world not as a myth, but as a child, born into the glittering yet treacherous court of Alexandria. She was the daughter of Ptolemy XII, the king whose reign had been fragile, almost pathetic, propped up by the gold he sent to Rome and the soldiers Rome sent back in return. Her father was known by his mocking nickname, Auletes, the flute player, a man who loved music and luxury more than the grim work of governing. To the Egyptians, he was a weak pharaoh. To the Greeks in Alexandria, he was a ruler whose survival depended entirely on Roman goodwill. This was the man who would shape Cleopatra's earliest years, a man both indulgent and insecure, and from him she learned her first lesson, that crowns may glitter, but they rest uneasily on heads. Her mother remains a mystery. Some believe she was Cleopatra V, a Ptolemaic princess and likely sister to Auletes, for in this dynasty sibling marriages were common. Others suggest that Cleopatra's mother may have been an Egyptian noblewoman, perhaps from a priestly family. If so, Cleopatra would have carried Egyptian blood in her veins, making her unique among her Greek ancestors. Though history does not give us certainty, the possibility that she was part Egyptian adds another dimension to her life. She was not entirely an outsider on the throne, but a queen who could claim kinship with both the conquerors and the conquered. The Ptolemaic court in which she grew up was dazzling on the surface and poisonous beneath. The marble halls of Alexandria's palaces rang with music, banquets, and the murmurs of courtiers. But behind the curtains lay schemes, rivalries, and sudden deaths. Siblings were not merely family, they were competitors for the throne. A sister might smile at you in the morning and plot your downfall by nightfall. In such an atmosphere, a royal child learned early how to listen more than to speak, how to calculate before acting, how to survive in silence until the moment came to strike. Cleopatra absorbed these lessons deeply. But she was not content to survive by caution alone. She showed an early hunger for learning, a curiosity that set her apart. In a world where queens were often ornamental, Cleopatra pursued knowledge. She studied with philosophers, priests, and tutors. She read Homer's verses, learned the histories of Herodotus, and absorbed the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. She trained her tongue in many languages. Greek was the language of her court, but she mastered Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, and perhaps Ethiopian tongues. Most astonishing of all, she learned Egyptian, becoming the first of her dynasty in centuries who could address her people in their own language. This was not a mere accomplishment. It was a declaration of identity. For the Egyptians, long ruled by foreign monarchs who seemed aloof and distant, a queen who spoke to them in their mother tongue was no longer a stranger. She was one of them. Education was not limited to books. Cleopatra was raised in Alexandria, and Alexandria itself was a classroom unlike any other. The Great Library, though already past its legendary peak, still housed tens of thousands of scrolls. Scholars debated astronomy, mathematics, and medicine in its halls. The museum, more than just a gallery, was a community of thinkers where knowledge was treated as sacred. The harbor bustled with ships from faraway lands, Phoenician traders, Roman envoys, African caravans bringing ivory, Indian merchants with spices. In this city, Cleopatra absorbed not only Greek thought, but the currents of the entire world. And then there was religion. The Ptolemies had always presented themselves as pharaohs, but Cleopatra went further. She did not only wear the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, she immersed herself in the cult of Isis. From childhood, she observed the rituals, the chants, the offerings, the connection between the goddess and the people. Isis was not just a deity, she was the mother, the healer, the protector, the embodiment of kingship. To associate herself with Isis was to bind herself to Egypt's deepest identity. Cleopatra grew up not only as a princess, but as a future goddess in the eyes of her people. Yet her childhood was far from peaceful. In 58 before Christ, when Cleopatra was around 11 years old, her father was driven from Egypt by a rebellion. The people, weary of his dependence on Rome and his lavish spending, cast him out. Cleopatra remained behind, while her elder sister Berenice seized the throne. Imagine the impression on a young girl. One day a king on the throne, the next a sister ruling in his place, her father exiled in Rome. For 3 years Berenice reigned, until Roman soldiers restored Olates. When he returned, he executed Berenice without mercy. Cleopatra survived, but she learned another harsh truth. Love among siblings was fragile, and power was merciless. These events sharpened her awareness. She knew that her own survival would depend on more than lineage. She would need wit, adaptability, and courage. She saw how her father had squandered his authority, how his dependency on Rome had made him a puppet, and she resolved not to repeat his mistakes. She understood that Egypt's throne was not secure, that the favor of Rome could make or unmake kings, and that in such a world only a ruler who could command both respect and fear would endure. As she grew into adolescence, Cleopatra honed her skills. She was trained in rhetoric, learning to speak with force and elegance, to persuade both friend and foe. She studied law and administration, for queens in Egypt did not sit idle. They judged disputes, oversaw taxation, and directed the harvests of the Nile. She learned how to lead processions, how to conduct rituals, how to present herself not only as a monarch, but a living embodiment of divine order. And she practiced charm, not the shallow art of seduction, but the deeper art of making others feel seen, heard, valued. Ancient accounts agree. When Cleopatra spoke, even the most skeptical listener found themselves leaning in. We can picture her now, a young woman in the palace of Alexandria. The marble floors gleam, the air is heavy with incense, courtiers whisper in corners. She moves among them with grace, listening, learning, smiling when needed, silent when prudent. Her eyes miss nothing. She already knows that one day her fate will not be to hide in shadows, but to step into the storm. And what a storm awaited! For in 51 before Christ, her father Ulatus died, leaving Egypt in a fragile state once again. Debt burdened the treasury, famine gnawed at the land, and Rome's influence pressed heavily on the throne. By his will, Cleopatra was named to rule alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, then a boy of around 10 years old. The crown was to be shared, but in truth it would be contested. For Cleopatra had no intention of being a silent partner. She had been shaped by too much struggle, had learned too well that survival meant seizing authority rather than waiting for it to be granted. At 18, Cleopatra stepped forward not as a princess, but as queen. She was young, but she carried within her the lessons of exile, rebellion, and restoration. She spoke to her people in Egyptian, aligned herself with Isis, and minted coins with her own image, an audacious statement that she, not her brother, was the true ruler. In the eyes of many Egyptians, she was not merely another Ptolemaic monarch, but the first in centuries who felt like a pharaoh of their own. Yet her brother's guardians and advisors, chief among them the regent Pothinus, saw this as a threat. They whispered against her, plotted her removal, and soon the palace of Alexandria, with its columns and golden halls, became a battlefield without swords. Words, intrigues, and decrees flew like arrows. The young queen, so newly crowned, already stood on the edge of exile. Her childhood was over. The years of learning, of listening, of preparation had ended. Now came the trial by fire, the first of many, as Cleopatra faced her own brother in a struggle for Egypt's soul. When Cleopatra took the throne at 18, she entered her reign with boldness. She had learned from her father's failures that timidity was fatal, and so she acted not as a girl bound by her brother's regents, but as pharaoh in her own right. In the ceremonies of her coronation, she stood beside Ptolemy XIII, the child king who was her husband by custom, but in truth still a boy. To the courtiers, it was clear that one of them would have to bend. Cleopatra had no intention of bending. From the very beginning, she projected authority. She minted coins bearing her image not as a co-ruler, but as sole monarch. On them, she was depicted with a strong profile, a determined nose, a jaw that spoke of resolve rather than softness. The message was unmistakable. Cleopatra was not a decoration for the throne. She was the throne. For the people of Egypt, weary of weak kings, this was exhilarating. Here was a queen who spoke their language, who invoked Isis, who walked the streets in processions as pharaoh, not merely as consort. But for Ptolemy XIII's advisors, this was intolerable. Chief among them was Pothinus, the eunuch regent who controlled the boy king's household. He was clever, ambitious, and fearful of a queen who might render him irrelevant. Alongside him were generals and courtiers who resented Cleopatra's independence. They saw in her coins not authority, but insolence. In her confidence, not leadership, but defiance. The palace of Alexandria, with its gilded ceilings and marble columns, became a nest of whispers. Pothinus and his allies plotted to diminish Cleopatra's power, to push her aside and rule through the young Ptolemy. Cleopatra, aware of the currents, pushed back with decrees, speeches, and alliances of her own. But she was young, and her enemies numerous. Soon the struggle broke into open confrontation. In 48 before Christ, only 3 years after she had been crowned, Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria. The boy king's faction, bolstered by courtiers and mercenaries, drove her from the palace. She retreated eastward into Syria, gathering what resources she could, raising an army from foreign mercenaries and loyalists who believed in her cause. Picture her now, no longer the princess of marble halls, but a queen in exile, riding under desert skies, speaking with commanders, offering gold for swords, bargaining with men who valued coin more than crowns. It was a precarious time. She was barely 21, young by any standard, yet she bore the weight of Egypt's survival on her shoulders. Her position was dangerous, her brother's power entrenched in Alexandria, her own forces untested. But Cleopatra did not falter. She had seen exile before, when her father had fled Rome's wrath, and she knew that power was not always held by armies. It was held by alliances. And at this very moment, as if fate had arranged the stage, Rome itself came crashing into Egypt's story. For while Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII contested the throne, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, the 2 giants of Rome, had torn the Republic apart. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, defied the Senate, and pursued Pompey across Greece. In the summer of 48 before Christ, Caesar defeated Pompey at Pharsalus, and Pompey fled, desperate, seeking refuge in Egypt. To Pompey's advisors, Pompey's arrival was a dilemma. To shelter him would be to defy Caesar. To kill him might offend Roman honor. In their calculation, the best course was treachery. They lured Pompey ashore under the guise of safety, then murdered him in cold blood, sending his severed head to Caesar as a gift. But if they thought Caesar would be pleased, they miscalculated. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he was horrified. Pompey had been his enemy, yes, but also his former ally, his son-in-law, a Roman consul. To kill him was one thing. To butcher him dishonorably was another. Caesar turned cold toward Ptolemy's faction, suspicious of their ruthlessness. This was Cleopatra's chance. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that Rome, not her brother, not her own army, would decide who sat upon Egypt's throne. If Caesar could be persuaded to support her, the crown would be hers again. But Caesar was in Alexandria, surrounded by Ptolemy's allies, and Cleopatra was in exile. She needed a way into the city, a way to stand before the most powerful man in the world without being killed first. What happened next is one of the most famous episodes of her life, embroidered by centuries of storytelling, yet rooted in truth. Cleopatra was smuggled into Caesar's presence not as a queen in procession, but as a contraband bundle. Ancient writers say she was rolled up in a carpet, others in a linen sack, and carried past guards into the palace. When the cloth was unfurled, out stepped Cleopatra, radiant, fearless, 21 years old, standing before Caesar in defiance of exile and death. Imagine the scene. The Roman general, weary from campaigns, hardened by war, sitting in the palace of Alexandria when servants unroll before him not gold, not tribute, but a queen. Cleopatra does not cower, she does not plead. She presents herself with wit, charm, and boldness. In that moment, she won him. Was it beauty? Roman propaganda would say so, painting her as a temptress who ensnared Caesar with her looks. But beauty alone does not capture a man like Caesar, who had faced conspiracies and wars without losing his head. More likely, it was her intellect, her eloquence, her audacity. Plutarch tells us her voice was irresistible, her conversation sharp and captivating. Cleopatra knew that survival was theater as much as politics, and in this act she performed brilliantly. Caesar, recognizing both her courage and her usefulness, sided with her. He declared that she, not her brother, would rule Egypt. Civil war erupted in Alexandria as Caesar's soldiers clashed with Ptolemy's forces. Cleopatra stood by Caesar, her position now entwined with Rome's. After months of struggle, Ptolemy XIII was defeated, drowned in the Nile as he tried to flee. Cleopatra was restored to her throne, this time ruling with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but it was clear to all that she was the true ruler. Her gamble had worked. She had turned exile into triumph, weakness into strength, through audacity, intelligence, and the ability to see that in the world of empires, survival depended not only on armies, but on the favor of Rome. And yet, this alliance with Caesar was not merely political. Cleopatra became his companion, his lover, and soon the mother of his son. Their relationship would bind Egypt and Rome in ways that terrified the Senate and shaped the destiny of both nations. But for now, Cleopatra had reclaimed her crown. The girl who had fled into exile returned as queen once more, her eyes open to the truth. That in the age of Rome, Egypt's throne could be secured only by standing beside giants, and she had found the greatest giant of them all in Julius Caesar. Cleopatra was queen once more, her throne restored by Julius Caesar's legions, her enemies defeated, her brother drowned in the waters of the Nile. But survival was only the beginning. The true measure of Cleopatra's reign would be her ability to secure her future in a world where Rome's shadow loomed larger with every passing year. And in Julius Caesar, she found not only the savior of her crown, but also a partner whose power reached further than the Nile could flow. In Alexandria, after the smoke of battle cleared, Cleopatra and Caesar lingered together. Their partnership was not simply one of convenience. Caesar, hardened general though he was, seems to have been genuinely captivated by the young queen. She was 21, he was 52, a man who had spent decades in the crucible of politics and war. For such a man, beauty alone could not explain her influence. Ancient sources tell us it was her intelligence, her eloquence, her charm in conversation that made her unforgettable. They spent the winter of 48 to 47 before Christ in the city, a season that history remembers as the Alexandrian War. Outside, the streets were tense, soldiers still patrolled, and rival factions lingered in shadow. Inside the palace, Cleopatra entertained Caesar with banquets, philosophy, and wit. She was not a passive companion, but an equal sparring partner, discussing politics, trade, and the intricacies of ruling. For the first time in centuries, Egypt had a ruler who could stand toe-to-toe with Rome's greatest mind. Soon, Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy 15, whom she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. To Cleopatra, this child was more than a personal joy. He was legitimacy embodied, the living proof that Egypt and Rome were joined not only in alliance, but in blood. Though Caesar never formally acknowledged the boy as his son, Cleopatra made no secret of it. For her, Caesarion was the guarantee of her dynasty's survival, a weapon as powerful as any army. In 46 before Christ, Cleopatra traveled to Rome with her child. Imagine the spectacle. The Queen of Egypt arriving in the eternal city, draped in silks and jewels, her attendants exotic, her very presence a reminder that the Nile, with all its wealth, now stood in Caesar's orbit. Romans, who prided themselves on their austere traditions, were dazzled and scandalized. Here was Cleopatra, not as captive or supplicant, but as honored guest. She lived in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, close enough for the city to whisper. The Senate grumbled. Cicero, the orator who despised monarchs, wrote venomously of her, calling her arrogant and insolent. To many Romans, she was a dangerous figure, foreign, regal, unapologetic. Her very existence seemed to challenge the ideals of the Republic, where kingship was a hated memory. And now she was in their city, mother of Caesar's child, carrying herself like a goddess. Caesar, meanwhile, continued to consolidate power. He reformed the calendar, built monuments, passed laws, and filled offices with his allies. His enemies feared that he meant to make himself king, and Cleopatra's presence did nothing to quiet those fears. Statues were erected of her as Isis, the living goddess, a gesture that to Romans felt like sacrilege. She attended ceremonies, walked in processions, and showed herself openly as Caesar's consort. To her, it was natural. To the Romans, it was provocation. The whispers grew louder. Would Caesar marry her? Would he bring Egypt into Rome as a personal dominion? Would Caesarion, half Roman, half Egyptian, inherit power meant for Romans alone? For a republic already trembling under Caesar's ambition, Cleopatra's presence was like oil on the fire. And then came the Ides of March, 44 before Christ. In the Senate House, Caesar was struck down by daggers, 23 wounds from men who claimed they were saving the Republic. The marble floor ran red, and the world shifted. Cleopatra, in Rome at the time, was thrown into sudden peril. Her protector was gone, her son's father slain. The senators who hated Caesar hated her too, and in the chaos she knew she must act quickly. She gathered Caesarion and fled Rome. The dream of ruling beside Caesar, of securing Egypt through their union, had ended in blood. But Cleopatra was not undone. She returned to Alexandria with her son, carrying with her both grief and resolve. She had lost Caesar, but she still had Caesarion, still had her throne, still had her people. She would not fade into the background of history. In the aftermath of Caesar's death, Rome fractured once more. Antony, Caesar's trusted general, and Octavian, Caesar's young heir by adoption, contested his legacy. The world braced for another civil war. Cleopatra watched from Alexandria, weighing her choices, preparing to step once again into the storm. But before Antony and Octavian, before Actium and the Asp, there is something we must understand. Cleopatra's years with Caesar were not just a romance. They were a demonstration of her political genius. She saw what others missed, that Egypt's survival depended not on isolation, but on engagement, not on resisting Rome, but on shaping it. By aligning herself with Caesar, by bearing him a son, she placed Egypt at the very heart of Roman politics. Yes, Rome despised her. Yes, propaganda painted her as a temptress. But Cleopatra knew the truth. She had walked in the streets of Rome. She had felt its awe and its suspicion. She had seen its Senate glare at her with fear. And she had returned to Egypt still a queen, still alive, still in command of her destiny. Picture her now, back in Alexandria after Caesar's death. The lighthouse still burns, the library still holds the wisdom of ages, the harbor still thrums with ships from distant lands. But Cleopatra walks its halls with a different gravity. She has faced the heart of Rome, and she has lost her protector. Yet she remains unbroken, her son at her side, her mind sharper than ever. She knows that the Republic will not rest, that Antony and Octavian will fight, and that once again she will have to choose her ally carefully. And in that choice, in that next chapter of her life, Cleopatra will find both love and destruction, triumph and tragedy, as she binds herself to Mark Antony in a partnership that will shake the ancient world. The assassination of Julius Caesar left a void that threatened to swallow Cleopatra whole. She had gambled everything on him, her throne, her legitimacy, even her son. With his death, she might have been expected to fade into obscurity, a foreign mistress remembered only with disdain by Rome. But Cleopatra was not a woman who surrendered to circumstance. She returned to Alexandria carrying her infant son Caesarion, determined to transform disaster into opportunity. Rome itself was in chaos. The daggers that struck Caesar had not restored the Republic. They had shattered it further. His assassins, Brutus and Cassius, fled eastward to rally support. In Rome, two men emerged to inherit his mantle: Mark Antony, Caesar's seasoned general and friend, and Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son. Antony commanded the loyalty of Caesar's veterans, men who had marched with him across Gaul and Greece. Octavian, though young, barely 19, carried Caesar's name and legal inheritance. It was an unlikely pairing, yet necessity forced them into alliance. Along with Lepidus, another Roman power broker, they formed the second triumvirate, sworn to avenge Caesar and rule Rome. Cleopatra observed all this from the safety of Egypt, but safety was an illusion. The tremors of Roman politics always reached the Nile. She had to decide how to align herself. At first, she tried neutrality, focusing on stabilizing Egypt. The years after Caesar's death were difficult ones for her kingdom. The treasury, drained by years of bribes to Rome and the costs of war, struggled. The harvests of the Nile, though still bountiful, were vulnerable to famine. Cleopatra had to act as pharaoh in the old sense, not merely queen of ceremonies, but guardian of her people's survival. She poured resources into maintaining the canals, ensuring the Nile's floods could be harnessed. She presided over rituals to Hapi, the god of the river, linking her reign with the eternal cycles of fertility. She supported the temples of Isis and Osiris, binding her image ever more tightly to the goddess she embodied. For her subjects, these gestures mattered. To them, Cleopatra was not just a Greek queen in an Egyptian land. She was Pharaoh, the living connection between gods and mortals. But the shadow of Rome lengthened. The triumvirs moved quickly against Caesar's assassins, meeting Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 before Christ. Antony and Octavian's victory was decisive. The liberators were crushed, their armies broken. With that, the triumvirs divided the Roman world. Octavian took the west, Antony the east, Lepidus Africa. For Cleopatra, this was a turning point. Antony, master of the eastern provinces, was now her neighbor, her judge, and perhaps her salvation. It was not long before he summoned her. In 41 before Christ, Antony called Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, in modern-day Turkey. Officially, it was to answer charges that she had aided Caesar's assassins, for Egypt had been accused of sending supplies to Cassius. In truth, Antony sought more than answers. He needed money, ships, and grain for his campaigns against Parthia. Cleopatra, wealthy queen of Egypt, could provide them. The summons was dangerous. To refuse was to defy the most powerful Roman in the East. To comply was to risk humiliation. But Cleopatra was not a woman to bow quietly. She turned the summons into an opportunity, into theater, into one of the most dazzling performances of her life. When she sailed up the river Cydnus to meet Antony, she did not arrive as a supplicant, but as a goddess. Ancient accounts, particularly Plutarch, describe the spectacle. Her barge sailed with purple sails billowing in the wind, its oars flashing silver in the sunlight. The decks were strewn with flowers, the air perfumed with incense. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, attended by maidens dressed as cupids, boys fanning her with feathers, music floating across the water. To the crowds on the riverbanks, it was as though divinity itself had descended. Antony was captivated before he even saw her face. He, a man of excess and appetite, who loved wine, revelry, and display, found in Cleopatra not only beauty, but a mirror of his own spirit. That evening, she invited him to a banquet of extraordinary splendor. The tables groaned with delicacies, goblets overflowed with wine, and the queen herself presided with wit and charm. She knew exactly how to play to Antony's character, bold, theatrical, indulgent. Roman writers, hostile to her memory, sneered that she seduced Antony with feasts and luxuries. But beneath the revelry lay strategy. Cleopatra understood Antony's needs. He sought wealth and ships. She sought Rome's recognition of her throne. By dazzling him, she bound him. By enchanting him, she secured Egypt's survival. Antony soon abandoned his stern accusations. Instead, he spent the winter of 4140 before Christ in Alexandria with Cleopatra, reveling in what Roman critics would later deride as debauchery. Together, they formed a society they called the Inimitable Livers, devoted to nights of drinking, feasting, games, and pranks. To the Romans, it seemed decadent. To Cleopatra, it was political theater, a way of binding Antony not only with passion but with companionship, of making him feel not merely her ally but her partner. During this time, Cleopatra bore him twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Their names were symbolic: Helios the sun, Selene the moon. They embodied a cosmic union, a pairing of opposites, east and west, light and darkness. For Cleopatra, the twins were more than children. They were another tie binding Egypt and Rome, heirs who linked her dynasty to one of Rome's most powerful men. Yet Antony could not remain in Alexandria forever. Rome still demanded his presence. Civil unrest flared, Octavian maneuvered, and Antony was compelled to return west. To seal peace with his rival, he married Octavia, Octavian's sister, a move that to Cleopatra must have seemed a betrayal. But Cleopatra did not despair. She had secured Antony's loyalty in other ways, through children, through memory, through the promise of shared grandeur. For several years, Antony balanced between his Roman obligations and his Egyptian passion. He fought Parthians in the east, negotiated with Octavian in Rome, but again and again he returned to Cleopatra. By 37 before Christ, they reunited in Antioch, and their partnership grew deeper still. Antony restored to her lands once lost, Cyprus, parts of Syria, and other territories, rebuilding fragments of the old Ptolemaic Empire. Cleopatra now ruled more than Egypt. She ruled a revived eastern dominion, with Antony as her consort. Soon another child was born, Ptolemy Philadelphus. With Caesarion, her son by Caesar, and her 3 children by Antony, Cleopatra's dynasty seemed stronger than ever. She was not only queen, but mother of heirs who united Egypt with Rome. In her mind, the dream of restoring Egyptian greatness was alive. But Rome was watching. To Octavian and his allies, Antony's devotion to Cleopatra was proof of corruption. They whispered that he had abandoned Roman virtue for Eastern decadence, that he was bewitched by a foreign queen, that he meant to make Alexandria the capital of the world. The propaganda machine turned, painting Cleopatra as the true enemy, Antony as her puppet. And so the stage was set for the greatest confrontation of their age. But before the swords were drawn and the ships clashed at Actium, there was still a moment of triumph: the donations of Alexandria, a spectacle in which Cleopatra and Antony declared their children rulers of lands stretching across the east. It was a proclamation that sent shockwaves through Rome and ensured that the war to come would be fought not only between men, but between empires, between worlds, between visions of power. For now, imagine Cleopatra at the height of her glory. The palaces of Alexandria shimmer in the sun. The harbor thrums with trade. The temples resound with hymns. She walks among her people as Isis reborn, Antony at her side as Osiris. Her children represent the future, her throne the present, her dreams the past reborn. She is no longer the young queen in exile. She is the last pharaoh, mistress of the Nile, challenger to Rome itself. But even as she celebrated, the shadow of Octavian lengthened, and the tide of destiny flowed toward a single fateful shore, Actium. For a brief and shimmering moment, Cleopatra and Mark Antony ruled as though the world itself might bend to their vision. After years of struggle, exile, and precarious alliances, Cleopatra now stood not merely as the Queen of Egypt, but as the centerpiece of a wider dominion, her influence stretching beyond the Nile to lands once held by her Ptolemaic ancestors. Antony, drawn again and again from Rome to Alexandria, embraced her world as if it were his own. Together, they created a court that dazzled friends and horrified enemies, a place of spectacle, abundance, and ambition. When Antony returned to Alexandria after his campaigns in the East, Cleopatra welcomed him with grandeur. The palaces gleamed with new marble. The harbor was alive with ships bringing treasures from across the Mediterranean, and the city hummed with trade and scholarship. Alexandria was no ordinary capital. It was the jewel of the Hellenistic world, a place where Greek thought, Egyptian riches, and Eastern riches blended into something unique. Here, Cleopatra was not only queen, but goddess, and Antony was not only general, but consort of Isis herself. The pair became inseparable. They dined together, hunted together, staged spectacles for the people. Ancient writers, especially Roman ones hostile to them, exaggerated their excesses, claiming they formed a society of inimitable livers, indulging in nightly feasts, games, and revels. They told tales of Cleopatra wagering that she could spend a fortune on a single banquet, of dissolving pearls in wine and drinking them to prove Egypt's wealth was inexhaustible. Whether truth or embellishment, these stories reveal how the world perceived them as rulers of unbounded luxury, living lives beyond the comprehension of ordinary mortals. But beneath the feasts lay strategy. Cleopatra knew that to bind Antony fully to her cause, she must make Alexandria not just his refuge, but his home. She gave him more than comfort. She gave him vision. Together, they imagined a world not ruled by Rome alone, but by an Eastern dominion centered on Egypt, where their children might inherit kingdoms and reshape the balance of power. This vision reached its boldest expression in the year 34 before Christ, in what history remembers as the Donations of Alexandria. After a successful campaign in Armenia, Antony returned to Egypt and staged a ceremony of breathtaking audacity. In the grand gymnasium of Alexandria, before a throng of spectators, he and Cleopatra appeared enthroned in splendor, dressed as gods. Cleopatra as Isis, Antony as Dionysus. Their children were arrayed beside them, dressed in regal robes, miniature monarchs awaiting their crowns. Before the crowd, Antony proclaimed the distribution of lands. To Alexander Helios, their son, he granted Armenia, Media, and Parthia yet to be conquered. To Cleopatra Selene, their daughter, he gave Cyrene and Libya. To their youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, he promised Syria and Cilicia. And to Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, Antony declared the grandest title of all, King of Kings, the true heir of Caesar. It was a proclamation as political as it was theatrical. Cleopatra's dynasty was no longer confined to Egypt. It was projected outward across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Her children were no longer mere royal offspring. They were rulers in waiting, embodiments of a new order that rivaled Rome itself. For Cleopatra, this was triumph. She had preserved her throne through Caesar, expanded it through Antony, and now envisioned a dynastic empire that might restore Egypt's glory. For Antony, it was both love and calculation. By elevating Caesarion, he challenged Octavian's claim as Caesar's heir. By distributing eastern lands, he declared himself master of the East, no longer bound by the Senate's decrees in Rome. But in Rome, the donations were received as scandalous treason. Octavian seized upon the event with fury and skill. His propaganda machine painted Antony as a traitor, bewitched by a foreign queen, betraying Roman lands to illegitimate children. Cleopatra became the perfect villain, the Eastern seductress, the queen who sought to enslave Rome, the corrupter of Antony's Roman virtue. Coins, speeches, and pamphlets spread the message that Rome was not fighting Antony, but fighting Cleopatra. The Senate, already uneasy with Antony's absences and indulgences, recoiled. They asked themselves whether Antony was still Roman, or whether he had become something else, an Eastern king enthralled by a goddess queen. Octavian did not miss his chance. In 32 before Christ, he had Antony's will seized from the Vestal Virgin's temple and read aloud in the Senate. In it, Antony acknowledged his children by Cleopatra and requested to be buried beside her in Alexandria. To Romans, this was unforgivable, a Roman statesman choosing Egypt over his own homeland. The scandal was complete. Octavian declared war, not on Antony officially, but on Cleopatra. Again, the brilliance of propaganda. It was not a civil war, but a foreign one, Rome defending itself from an Eastern threat. Senators who might have hesitated to fight Antony felt no such hesitation against a queen portrayed as a scheming sorceress. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra remained undaunted. She prepared her fleet, gathered her armies, and fortified her city. She and Antony stood together as partners, presenting themselves as the true heirs of Alexander's vision, rulers not only of Egypt, but of the East. Their children symbolized a dynasty that would outlast them, kings and queens of lands stretching from Libya to Armenia. But Cleopatra must have known the danger. Octavian was ruthless, ambitious, and determined. His admiral, Agrippa, was brilliant, his soldiers disciplined, his propaganda relentless. The tide of Rome was against her, and the world whispered that the coming conflict would decide not only Antony's fate, but Egypt's independence itself. Still, she did not flinch. To her people, she was Isis, the eternal mother, the goddess who defended Egypt against chaos. She appeared in ceremonies in robes of shimmering white, bearing the sistrum of the goddess, her hair adorned with the horns and solar disk of Hathor. She offered sacrifices, presided over festivals, and declared that Egypt would endure. Her charisma bound her people to her. Even as Rome gathered its legions, Alexandria believed. For Antony, the years in Alexandria were both a reprieve and a trap. He delighted in the city's luxuries, in Cleopatra's companionship, in the sense of being more than a Roman politician, of being a king in a world of kings. Yet this very indulgence eroded his standing in Rome, where Octavian painted him as decadent, faithless, un-Roman. Each feast in Alexandria became, in Roman imagination, another nail in his coffin. And yet, to dismiss these years as mere indulgence would be unfair. Cleopatra and Antony together forged a partnership unlike any other in antiquity. They were not merely lovers, they were co-rulers, bound by ambition and children, by ritual and vision. Their union represented a challenge to Rome itself, a statement that empire need not belong to the West alone. But empire is not built on vision alone. It is built on ships, soldiers, and strategy. And here lay their weakness. Rome was unified under Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra were isolated in Alexandria. The donations of Alexandria had been their boldest gamble, but it also ensured that Rome would accept nothing less than their destruction. As 32 turned to 31 before Christ, the world braced for war. Octavian gathered his forces, spreading the word that he fought not Antony, but the foreign queen who sought to make herself empress of the world. Cleopatra marshaled Egypt's wealth, sending carpenters to build ships, scribes to prepare accounts, priests to call upon the gods. In the harbors of Alexandria, the fleets gathered, oarsmen trained, sails stitched, weapons forged. The stage was set for Actium, where dreams and propaganda would collide in smoke, fire, and the clash of empires. Cleopatra had risen from exile to power, from scandal to glory, from queen of Egypt to mistress of a dynasty that dared to rival Rome. Now she stood at the height of her reign, radiant as Isis, her children's futures secured on thrones of promise. But glory and ruin often walk hand in hand. And for Cleopatra, the tide was about to turn. The summer sun of 31 before Christ rose over the Ionian Sea, casting its light on two fleets that faced one another like mirrored reflections of ambition. On one side stood Cleopatra and Mark Antony, commanding the might of Egypt's wealth and eastern allies, their ships vast and imposing. On the other side stood Octavian, the young heir of Caesar, with his seasoned admiral Agrippa, his disciplined legions, and the power of Rome united under his banner. Between them lay the fate of empires. For months leading to Actium, tension had built like a storm over calm waters. Octavian had seized the narrative before the battle even began. His propaganda spread through Italy and the provinces, declaring that Antony was no longer Roman, but a slave of Cleopatra. He accused the queen of plotting to move Rome's capital to Alexandria, of conspiring to place Caesarion as Caesar's heir above Octavian himself. Every whisper, every decree, every coin from Octavian's mint painted Cleopatra as the true enemy. And so, when Rome marched to war, it was not with divided loyalties, but with a sense of righteous purpose. They fought not Antony, but a foreign queen. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared as fiercely as any general. She poured treasure into the fleet, supplied Antony's soldiers, and oversaw the construction of massive warships, some towering with multiple decks, bristling with catapults and armed soldiers. Her navy was among the largest in the ancient world, but size was not everything. Octavian's fleet, under Agrippa's command, was smaller but swifter, designed for maneuver rather than brute force. The contrast mirrored the leaders themselves. Cleopatra and Antony, bold, magnificent, and extravagant. Octavian and Agrippa, disciplined, calculating, and relentless. By late summer, both sides converged at Actium, a narrow promontory on the western coast of Greece. Antony's forces occupied the Gulf, their ships anchored, their soldiers restless. Octavian's fleet hovered outside, avoiding direct battle, while Agrippa cut off Antony's supplies. Day after day, hunger gnawed at the Eastern army. Disease crept through the camps, morale frayed, and desertions began. Antony's commanders urged retreat, but pride bound him to his position. To abandon the battle would be to concede defeat without a fight. Cleopatra was there, not in the shadows, but at the heart of the fleet. She commanded her own squadron of ships, richly adorned, their sails purple, their crews loyal to their queen. Her presence was both inspiration and provocation. To Antony's men, she embodied the grandeur of Egypt, the promise of victory. To Octavian's soldiers, she was the sorceress who had ensnared their enemy. On the morning of September 2nd, the two fleets clashed. The sea churned with oars and foam, the air filled with shouts, the thunder of rams striking hulls, the hiss of arrows, the crash of firepots hurled onto decks. Antony's massive ships, though formidable, were sluggish in the narrow waters. Agrippa's lighter vessels darted around them, striking, retreating, striking again. The battle raged for hours, smoke rising into the sky, the coastline echoing with the cries of war. And then, in the midst of chaos, Cleopatra made her fateful move. With her squadron of 60 ships, she broke from the line and sailed through the battle, escaping into open water. Ancient sources disagree on why. Some say she panicked, overcome by fear. Others believe it was prearranged, a contingency plan, should the battle turn against them. Perhaps she saw that defeat was inevitable and chose survival over slaughter. Whatever the reason, her departure shattered Antony's resolve. When Antony saw Cleopatra's sails vanishing into the horizon, he abandoned his command. Leaving the battle behind, he leapt into a smaller vessel and followed her. His fleet, stunned and leaderless, fought on briefly, but soon collapsed. Many ships surrendered, others were burned, their crews slain or captured. Octavian had triumphed, not merely through tactics, but through patience, propaganda, and the unraveling of his enemy's will. The Battle of Actium was not just a naval defeat, it was the death knell of Cleopatra's dream. The donations of Alexandria, the vision of a dynasty stretching across the East, the promise of Caesarion as King of Kings, all evaporated in smoke and salt water. From that day, the outcome was inevitable. Cleopatra and Antony fled back to Egypt, their hearts heavy with loss, their futures hanging by a thread. Yet even in defeat, Cleopatra did not surrender. She returned to Alexandria and threw herself into preparations. The city fortified its walls, the harbor refilled with ships, the treasuries opened to fund defense. Cleopatra donned the robes of Isis once more, appearing before her people as the eternal goddess, unbroken, unbowed. She knew Octavian would come, but she would meet him as queen, not as captive. Antony, however, was a shadow of the man he had been. Once Caesar's greatest general, victor of countless campaigns, he now struggled with despair. His soldiers deserted in growing numbers, his allies melted away, and whispers of betrayal surrounded him. Cleopatra tried to rally him, to remind him of their shared purpose, their children, their love. But Antony could see the writing on the wall. Rome was united, and he was alone. Octavian, methodical as ever, advanced slowly. He did not rush to storm Alexandria. He let time and hunger do the work. By the summer of 30 before Christ, his legions marched into Egypt, unopposed by many who once swore loyalty to Antony. The end had come. As Octavian closed in, Antony's fortunes collapsed completely. In a final skirmish outside Alexandria, his forces were routed. Broken, humiliated, he returned to the city. Then came the cruelest blow. He was told, falsely, that Cleopatra was dead. Stricken with grief, Antony chose the Roman way of ending dishonor. He fell upon his sword. But the wound was not immediately fatal. Hearing that Cleopatra still lived, he had himself carried, bleeding, to her mausoleum, where she had taken refuge. There, in a chamber filled with treasures and memories, Antony died in her arms. His last moments were not on the battlefield, but with Cleopatra, the woman for whom he had risked everything, the woman whose fate was now bound inseparably to his own. His death was both tragedy and release. Tragedy because he had fallen from the heights of glory to despair. Release because he no longer had to face the humiliation of Octavian's triumph. Cleopatra was left alone, the last pharaoh, standing against the inexorable tide of Rome. Octavian entered Alexandria not as conqueror of a foreign land, but as master of the Mediterranean. He demanded Cleopatra's surrender, hoping to parade her through Rome as a living trophy, proof of his victory over the East. But Cleopatra had no intention of being paraded like a captive. She had lived as a goddess, as Isis reborn, as queen of one of the world's greatest civilizations. She would not die in chains. In August of 30 before Christ, Cleopatra chose death. The details remain cloaked in mystery. The most famous story tells of the asp, a venomous snake hidden in a basket of figs, whose bite delivered swift release. Others suggest she used poison or a sharp implement laced with venom. Whatever the method, the truth is clear. Cleopatra chose her own fate. She denied Octavian his triumph, denied Rome its spectacle, and preserved her dignity to the very end. When Octavian entered her chamber, he found her lifeless body, dressed in royal robes, her crown upon her head, attendants dead beside her. She had ruled as queen, died as queen, and left behind a legend that would outlive empires. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Caesarion, her son with Caesar, was captured and executed on Octavian's orders, for 2 Caesars is 1 too many. Her children by Antony were spared, taken to Rome, raised in Octavia's household. Egypt itself was annexed, transformed from kingdom to province, its grain flowing to Rome, its treasures filling Octavian's coffers. And Octavian himself, now unrivaled, soon became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Thus ended not only Cleopatra's reign, but 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. From the unification of Egypt under Narmer to the brilliance of Ramses, from the temples of Thebes to the libraries of Alexandria, the line was broken. The Nile still flowed, the pyramids still stood, but Egypt was no longer its own master. And yet, in that final act of defiance, Cleopatra ensured that she would not be remembered as a captive, but as a queen who chose her end. Octavian built his empire upon her defeat, but her legend was carved into the memory of the world, a story of love and ambition, glory and ruin, beauty and intellect. Even now, 2 millennia later, we see her not through Octavian's triumph, but through her own refusal. The last pharaoh had fallen, but her name would never be forgotten. After the smoke of Actium and the blood of Alexandria, Cleopatra found herself standing alone against the tide of history. Antony was dead, his last breath spent in her arms. Her fleet lay in ruins, her army scattered, and Octavian's legions occupied her capital. The queen who once dreamed of reviving Alexander's empire now faced a world narrowed to a single choice: surrender or die. Octavian, cold and methodical, understood the power of symbols. To capture Cleopatra alive was more valuable than any treasure. He envisioned her paraded through the streets of Rome in golden chains, a living proof of his triumph, a foreign queen humiliated before cheering crowds. Such a spectacle would confirm his victory not only over Antony, but over the decadent East itself. Cleopatra, however, had no intention of playing that role. She had lived her life as pharaoh, as Isis reborn, as queen of the Nile. To be reduced to a captive in Octavian's procession was unthinkable. Yet she was not reckless. Before embracing death, she tried once more to wield her greatest weapons, her wit, her eloquence, and her capacity to bend others to her will. She arranged to meet Octavian, not as a supplicant, but as a queen. Ancient sources tell us that she appeared before him dressed in mourning robes, her hair unadorned, her face pale with grief. Yet even in sorrow she radiated dignity. She spoke of her loyalty to Caesar's memory, reminded him that she had once stood beside Julius himself, that she was not merely an enemy, but a queen bound by ties of blood through her son, Caesarion. She pleaded not for her own life, but for the lives of her children. Octavian listened, impassive. He was not a man easily swayed by beauty or words. His eyes were on Rome, on the image of himself as savior and master. He promised nothing, revealed little. But Cleopatra could see in his silence that mercy was not his intent. He would use her if possible, destroy her if necessary, and erase any threat to his claim as Caesar's heir. For days, Cleopatra lingered in her mausoleum, a grand tomb she had prepared long before, filled with treasures and emblems of her reign. She brought her children to her, embracing them, whispering words of love and sorrow. To her, they were her true legacy. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, and her children by Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. She must have known their fates were uncertain. Rome had little mercy for rival heirs. Yet, perhaps, she hoped, Octavian's sister Octavia might protect them, for she was already guardian to Antony's other children. The days stretched heavy with foreboding. Cleopatra's attendants, Charmian and Iris, loyal beyond measure, remained with her, preparing her meals, singing soft songs, keeping vigil in the silence of the tomb. Outside, Roman guards watched, reporting her every move to Octavian. Yet within those walls, Cleopatra plotted her final act. She knew that her death must be her own, chosen and dignified, not delivered by Octavian's hand. And she knew that her death must carry meaning, that it must echo through the ages as an act of defiance rather than despair. In choosing her end, she would deny Octavian his triumph and secure her legend. How exactly she died remains one of history's enduring mysteries. The most famous account, told by Plutarch and repeated through centuries, is that she arranged for a basket of figs to be smuggled into her chamber. Beneath the fruit coiled an asp, a venomous Egyptian serpent sacred to Isis. Cleopatra, serene, allowed the snake to bite her breast or her arm, the poison delivering swift death. To the ancient imagination, it was perfect. The Queen of Egypt dying by the kiss of her land's sacred creature, uniting herself with the goddess she had embodied in life. But other accounts suggest different ends. Some say she used a sharp implement, a needle or comb dipped in poison, concealed among her cosmetics. Others claim she drank a vial of toxins prepared in secrecy by her physicians. The Romans themselves were uncertain. Octavian ordered investigations, but the truth was never clear. Perhaps that was Cleopatra's final triumph, that her death remained a riddle impossible for her conqueror to fully control. What is certain is that she did not die alone. Charmian and Iris, her faithful attendants, chose to follow her into death. When Octavian's men broke into the chamber, they found Cleopatra lifeless, adorned in royal robes, her crown upon her head. Iris was already dead at her feet, and Charmian, barely alive, was adjusting her mistress's diadem. When a soldier shouted angrily, demanding if this was well done, she replied with her last breath, "It is fitting for so great a queen." Then she too collapsed. Octavian's fury was great. He had lost his prize, his chance to parade Cleopatra through Rome. Yet even he could not deny the power of her final act. She had robbed him of spectacle, but in doing so, she had given herself immortality. The aftermath was swift and ruthless. Caesarion, Cleopatra's eldest son, was captured as he fled south. Despite initial promises of mercy, Octavian ordered his execution. "Two Caesars are one too many," he is said to have remarked. The boy, perhaps 16, carried in his veins both Egyptian royalty and the blood of Julius Caesar. To Octavian, that alone made him too dangerous to live. Cleopatra's children by Antony were spared. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken to Rome. There they were placed in the household of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and Octavian's sister. For Cleopatra, this was at least a small comfort in death, that her children would be raised with dignity, though far from the Nile, far from the land she had fought to preserve. Egypt itself was transformed overnight. It ceased to be a kingdom and became a province of Rome, not ruled by senators or proconsuls, but directly by Octavian himself. Egypt was too rich, too vital, too dangerous to be left in any hands but his. Its grain fed Rome, its gold filled his treasury. Its temples and monuments became symbols of his dominion. The wealth of Cleopatra's kingdom helped build the empire that Octavian would soon rule as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And yet, for all his power, Octavian could not erase her. He could annex Egypt, kill Caesarion, and claim victory. But Cleopatra's death became legend almost at once. Poets and storytellers spread tales of her beauty, her defiance, her dramatic suicide. To Romans, she was remembered as the dangerous queen who had ensnared Antony. To Egyptians, she remained the last pharaoh, the embodiment of Isis. To later generations, she became a symbol of love, ambition, and the eternal struggle between East and West. Imagine her tomb, sealed in the heat of an Alexandrian summer. Within its stone walls lay the queen, her attendants, her treasures, and her silence. Outside, the Nile flowed as it had for millennia, indifferent to the triumphs and failures of mortals. The lighthouse still blazed across the harbor. The library still held its scrolls. The streets still bustled with life. But something had ended. With Cleopatra's death, 3,000 years of pharaonic rule were gone. Egypt was no longer a land of kings, but a province in another's empire. And yet, Cleopatra endures. The manner of her death, whether by asp or poison, whether serene or agonized, has never ceased to fascinate. The mystery is part of her power. She denied Octavian the certainty of controlling her story, just as she denied him the spectacle of her humiliation. In death, as in life, Cleopatra was mistress of her own fate. As night fell over Alexandria in those final days of 30 before Christ, perhaps the people whispered of their queen's courage. Perhaps they wept at the loss of a ruler who had spoken their language, who had stood among them not as foreigner, but as pharaoh. Perhaps they saw in her death not defeat, but a kind of victory, the victory of dignity over chains, of choice over submission. And for us, centuries later, that is why her name still lingers when the names of so many kings and generals are forgotten. She did not build pyramids. She did not carve her likeness into cliffs. She did not conquer lands with armies, yet she conquered memory itself. The last pharaoh was gone, but her legend was only beginning. With Cleopatra's death, the dynasty of the Ptolemies crumbled into silence. For nearly 3 centuries, her family had ruled Egypt, tracing its line back to one of Alexander the Great's generals. They had raised temples, commanded armies, and racked themselves in the titles of pharaohs. Yet, in truth, they had always balanced precariously between Egyptian tradition and Greek identity, between local sovereignty and foreign dependence. Cleopatra had been the last to hold that balance, and when she chose death, the long chain of pharaohs snapped forever. The immediate question after her passing was the fate of her children. Caesarion, her eldest son by Julius Caesar, had been her greatest hope. From the moment of his birth, Cleopatra had declared him Pharaoh, son of the god Caesar, king of kings. She had placed him alongside her on coins, paraded him in ceremonies, and presented him as the legitimate heir of Julius himself. At the donations of Alexandria, Antony had proclaimed Caesarion as the true successor of Caesar, the living rival to Octavian. That alone sealed his doom. When Cleopatra died, Caesarion was about 16. Loyal advisors urged him to flee south, toward Nubia or India, to escape Octavian's reach. He tried, but he never made it far. Octavian's men intercepted him. The young boy was brought back, a symbol of danger too great to be ignored. To Octavian, the logic was merciless. As long as Caesarion lived, whispers would rise that the true son of Caesar, not the adopted Octavian, should rule Rome. And so the boy was quietly executed. Ancient writers put cruel words into Octavian's mouth. 2 Caesars are one too many. Whether he said it or not, the sentiment was real. Caesarion was erased, the last hope of Cleopatra's vision snuffed out. Her other children, however, were spared. Antony and Cleopatra had 3 together: the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the younger Ptolemy Philadelphus. They were too young to pose immediate threat, and they were, after all, Antony's offspring. Octavian had little desire to stain his victory with the blood of children when he could instead use them as living trophies. In a grim irony, the children of Cleopatra were taken to Rome, the very city their mother had sought to influence and perhaps to rule. They marched in Octavian's triumphal procession, not as captives in chains, but displayed as exotic symbols of conquest. In a grim irony, the children of Cleopatra were taken to Rome, the very city their mother had sought to influence and perhaps to rule. They marched in Octavian's triumphal procession, not as captives in chains, but displayed as exotic symbols of conquest. The boy Alexander Helios wore Median robes, representing the eastern lands once promised to him. Cleopatra Selene wore regal dress, embodying the future queen she might have been. The youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, too small to understand the spectacle, walked beside them. For the Roman crowds, it was theater. The children of the defeated queen paraded before them, their crowns transformed into ornaments of Octavian's glory. For the children themselves, it must have been bewildering, a blur of faces, jeers, and cheers, their identities stripped away, their futures rewritten. After the triumph, Octavian entrusted them to his sister, Octavia, the wife Antony had cast aside for Cleopatra. By all accounts, Octavia treated them kindly. She raised them in her household alongside her own children. Under her care, they grew not as royalty, but as Roman nobles, their lives redirected by the tides of history. Of the 3, Cleopatra Selene's fate is the best known. As she grew, her beauty and intelligence echoed her mother's, and she caught the attention of King Juba II of Mauritania, a North African kingdom allied with Rome. Octavian, now Augustus, arranged the marriage, and thus Cleopatra Selene became Queen of Mauritania. In her new court, she blended Egyptian, Greek, and Roman traditions, commissioning monuments adorned with symbols of the Nile. Some say she built a great mausoleum for herself and Juba, echoing the grandeur of Alexandria. Through her, a fragment of Cleopatra's legacy lived on, transplanted to another shore. Her brothers, however, vanished into obscurity. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappear from the record, their names swallowed by silence. Perhaps they died young, of illness or misfortune. Perhaps they lived quietly under Roman watch, their royal blood a burden they could never escape. History does not remember them, and that too is part of Cleopatra's tragedy. The children who might have ruled kingdoms instead vanished into anonymity. As for Egypt, its transformation was profound. No longer ruled by pharaohs, it became a province under the direct control of Augustus. Unlike other provinces which were governed by senators, Egypt was placed under the emperor's personal authority. He appointed equestrian prefects, men of the knightly class, to govern in his name. The message was clear. Egypt was too rich, too vital, too dangerous to be entrusted to anyone but Augustus himself. Its grain fed Rome, its gold enriched his treasury. Its monuments stood as silent witnesses to his conquest. The priests of Egypt adapted quickly, as they always had. They inscribed Augustus's name in hieroglyphs, crowned him pharaoh in their temples, and continued rituals as though nothing had changed. To the villagers along the Nile, life went on. The river still flooded, the fields still yielded, the gods still received offerings. Yet something intangible had ended. Egypt was no longer a kingdom unto itself. It was part of Rome, its destiny tied to the fortunes of emperors in distant lands. And Cleopatra's memory? To the Romans, she was cast as villain, the foreign queen who had bewitched Antony, corrupted him, and nearly toppled their republic. Poets wrote of her as a fury, a witch, a temptress. Virgil in the Aeneid described her fleeing Actium with monstrous gods at her side. Horace mocked her as drunk with ambition, though he admitted she faced death with courage. Propertius and others reduced her to a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when love and power entwine. This narrative served Rome well. It justified Octavian's triumph, glorified his victory, and diminished his rival Antony by blaming Cleopatra for his downfall. But beneath the propaganda lay another truth. Cleopatra had outlasted her father, her siblings, and countless rivals. She had ruled for 2 decades in an age when few monarchs survived so long. She had faced Rome's greatest leaders, Caesar, Antony, Octavian, and for years held her own. Her death was not weakness, but choice, an act of defiance that even her enemies could not erase. As for her children, their lives remind us that history's legacies are not only in monuments and battles, but in the quiet survival of bloodlines. Cleopatra Selene, in her new kingdom of Mauritania, named her son Ptolemy, carrying forward the dynasty's name, even as the dynasty itself had ended. In her court, Egyptian motifs blended with Roman styles, a cultural fusion that echoed her mother's life. Through her, Cleopatra's legacy stretched beyond Egypt, carried into a new land, reshaped yet unbroken. And so, though the dynasty of the Ptolemies was extinguished, its spirit lingered, in memories, in myths, in children who carried fragments of its glory into foreign lands. The Nile no longer crowned pharaohs, but the story of its last queen had only just begun. For in death, Cleopatra became larger than life, her legend growing even as her dynasty faded. Rome had won the war, but Cleopatra had won eternity. In death, Cleopatra became more dangerous than she had ever been in life. Octavian had defeated her, annexed Egypt, and eradicated her dynasty, yet her memory lingered, vibrant and unruly. For Augustus, as Octavian was soon to be known, the battle for Cleopatra's image was as crucial as the battle for Alexandria had been. To justify his power, to cement his place as savior of Rome, he needed to control the story of Cleopatra. And so, propaganda became his weapon. From the moment he declared war, Augustus had carefully framed the conflict. He did not tell Romans that he fought against Antony, a fellow citizen, for that would have been civil war, a word that stank of blood and treachery. Instead, he declared war on Cleopatra, the foreign queen, the Eastern temptress who threatened to enslave Rome. By making her the villain, he made himself the defender of the Republic. Antony's betrayal was explained not as his own weakness, but as the result of Cleopatra's sorcery. Rome, in this telling, was not tearing itself apart. It was defending itself from invasion. This narrative persisted long after her death. Roman poets and historians, eager to flatter Augustus and fearful of his wrath, poured venom into their portrayals of Cleopatra. Virgil, in his epic Aeneid, cast her as a monstrous figure at the Battle of Actium, fleeing in terror as Roman gods rose against her. Horace described her as drunk with fortune's gifts, a queen swollen with ambition, though even he admitted that she met death with courage worthy of admiration. Propertius and Ovid, too, painted her as both dangerous and fascinating, a woman whose allure was inseparable from her destruction. Roman historians followed suit. Plutarch, writing a century later, sought a more balanced tone, noting her intelligence and eloquence, her wit and charisma. Yet even he could not entirely escape the mold cast by Augustus's propaganda. Cleopatra was always entwined with Antony's ruin, always the foreign queen who lured Rome's greatest men away from their duties. Dio Cassius, writing in the 3rd century, was harsher still, portraying her as little more than a seductress whose power lay in manipulation. This image was no accident. Augustus understood that history is not only what happens, but what people choose to remember. By vilifying Cleopatra, he glorified himself. By painting her as decadent and treacherous, he made his own victory appear inevitable, even righteous. Her death became the necessary end to a tale of Roman virtue triumphing over Eastern corruption. Yet, ironically, this propaganda did not diminish her. If anything, it magnified her. Cleopatra became larger than life in Roman imagination. She was not forgotten as so many queens had been, but immortalized as the embodiment of Rome's fears and fascinations. The Romans despised her, but they could not look away. It is worth pausing to consider why Cleopatra became such a perfect vessel for their anxieties. To Romans, monarchy itself was suspect. They prided themselves on having overthrown kings centuries earlier, on being a republic ruled by laws and citizens rather than monarchs. Cleopatra, proudly a monarch, symbolized everything they distrusted. To Romans, women were expected to wield influence quietly, from the shadows of households. Cleopatra ruled openly, in her own name, as Pharaoh, as Isis. She did not conceal her authority behind men, she claimed it. To Romans, who feared powerful women, this was dangerous, even monstrous. She was also foreign, and to the Roman mind, foreignness was often conflated with decadence and treachery. The East was a land of silks and spices, perfumes and luxuries, of gold too bright and banquets too rich. Cleopatra embodied this stereotype perfectly, or rather, Roman writers forced her into that mold. By describing her as drenched in jewels, lounging on golden couches, dissolving pearls in wine, they made her the epitome of Eastern excess. Antony, in contrast, was portrayed as a once noble Roman undone by this exotic corruption. The irony is sharp. Cleopatra's reign was not merely one of indulgence. She was practical, pragmatic, a ruler who managed Egypt's resources, spoke to her people in their language, and aligned herself with their gods. Yet the Romans erased this side of her, preferring the caricature of the temptress queen. In doing so, they gave her immortality as a symbol, but at the cost of truth. This Roman version of Cleopatra endured for centuries. Medieval chroniclers, drawing on Roman texts, repeated the tale of a sinful queen undone by lust. She was used as a moral example, a warning to women about ambition and desire. In their hands, Cleopatra was not a strategist or a ruler, but a cautionary figure, a sinner whose punishment was death. The brilliance of her political maneuvering, her ability to survive in the storm of Roman politics, was forgotten. And yet, even within Roman accounts, glimmers of admiration shine through. Horace, though he mocked her ambition, could not help but marvel at her courage in death. Plutarch, though shaped by propaganda, admitted her eloquence, her wit, her ability to enthrall. Even Dio Cassius, harsh as he was, could not deny her intelligence. These cracks in the narrative remind us that propaganda never fully erases truth. It merely buries it beneath layers of rhetoric. We must also remember that Romans themselves were fascinated by what they claimed to despise. Cleopatra's banquets, her costumes, her theatrical entrances all became part of Roman lore, retold endlessly in gossip, in satire, in history. She haunted their imagination, both feared and desired, loathed and envied. Perhaps this is why her legend endured while so many others faded. She represented not only a foreign queen, but Rome's own contradictions, its simultaneous hunger for and fear of luxury, beauty, and power. Imagine a Roman household decades after Actium. Children sit at their father's knee as he tells the tale of Antony and Cleopatra, how their love destroyed them, how Rome was saved from Eastern corruption. The moral is clear. Rome's virtue triumphs, Cleopatra's decadence fails. Yet the children, wide-eyed, remember not Octavian's discipline, but Cleopatra's spectacle. The purple sails, the pearl dissolved in wine, the queen who chose death rather than chains. Propaganda could dictate the lesson, but it could not control the imagination. And so, the Cleopatra remembered by Rome was not the pragmatic ruler who spoke Egyptian, who stabilized her kingdom, who preserved its independence for 2 decades against impossible odds. She was not the pharaoh who embodied Isis, the strategist who maneuvered between Caesar, Antony, and Octavian. Instead, she became a myth, the femme fatale, the enchantress, the destroyer of men. It was a distortion, but one that gave her eternal life in cultural memory. For Augustus, this distortion was victory. By shaping Cleopatra's image, he shaped his own. He became the man who saved Rome from the Queen of the East, the heir of Caesar who triumphed over corruption. His empire was built not only on legions and laws, but on stories. And Cleopatra's story was his greatest tool. But for us, looking back across 2 millennia, we can see more clearly. We can see the queen who used every tool at her disposal, beauty, wit, ceremony, and strategy, to protect her throne. We can see the woman who faced Rome's greatest leaders and, for a time, matched them. We can see the defiance in her death, the brilliance in her reign, and the injustice of the narrative that sought to reduce her to a caricature. Cleopatra, in the eyes of Rome, was villain, temptress, monster. Cleopatra, in truth, was a ruler, a survivor, a woman who carved her name into history against impossible odds. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: by trying to erase her, Rome ensured she would never be forgotten. After Cleopatra's death, Rome's narrative dominated. For centuries, her memory was filtered through the words of poets and historians loyal to Augustus. To them, she was the dangerous queen, the seductress whose allure destroyed Antony and nearly brought ruin to the Republic. That was the image inherited by medieval Europe, a world that looked back on antiquity through the prism of Roman texts. Yet the Middle Ages did not merely repeat Rome's version. They reshaped it to suit their own moral lessons. In medieval literature, Cleopatra often appeared in collections known as mirrors for princes or moral exemplars, texts designed to teach rulers and common folk alike about virtue and vice. To monks and scholars, she was the archetype of sinful desire. Her story was told not as history, but as cautionary tale. A woman undone by lust, a queen who placed passion above duty, a sinner whose end was a warning to all. She was grouped with other infamous women, Helen of Troy, Jezebel, Delilah, figures blamed for the downfall of men and kingdoms. These portrayals reveal less about Cleopatra herself than about the anxieties of medieval society. In an age dominated by the Church, where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and chaste, Cleopatra's assertive power was intolerable. Her love affairs with Caesar and Antony were not seen as political strategies, but as moral failings. Her death, noble in Roman eyes, was interpreted as punishment for her sins. The Cleopatra of the Middle Ages was stripped of intellect and strategy, reduced to lust and vanity. Yet even in this dark mirror, her allure could not be erased. Illuminated manuscripts depicted her in regal robes, crowned and adorned, a queen who commanded attention even as scribes condemned her. Her very presence in these moral tales ensured that she lingered in imagination, a figure too fascinating to ignore. By the late Middle Ages, as Europe entered the Renaissance, something began to shift. The rediscovery of classical texts, the revival of Greek and Roman learning, and the flourishing of humanist thought reopened Cleopatra's story to new interpretations. Scholars and artists sought not only to condemn, but to explore, not only to moralize, but to dramatize. And in this exploration, Cleopatra was reborn. Painters of the Renaissance found in her death a subject of haunting beauty. They depicted her in her final moments, reclining on couches of gold, her breast or arm bared, the asp poised to strike. These paintings mingled eroticism with tragedy, blending fascination with fear. Cleopatra became a muse of contrast, sensual yet doomed, regal yet vulnerable, beautiful yet fatal. For artists, she was a canvas on which to project the tensions of their own age, between body and soul, passion and virtue, glory and ruin. Poets, too, embraced her. In Italy, she appeared in Petrarch's Triumphs, where her story symbolized the fleeting nature of earthly power. In France and England, she featured in collections of tragic heroines, her tale recited alongside those of Dido and Medea. Yet here, her voice began to emerge. Some writers imagined her speaking in her own defense, justifying her choices, declaring her love, asserting her dignity. Slowly, Cleopatra shifted from silent cautionary figure to tragic heroine. The theater brought her most vividly to life. In the 16th century, plays across Europe dramatized her story, blending history with invention. She was no longer merely Antony's downfall, but a character in her own right, with lines to speak, emotions to express, choices to make. Audiences saw not just her seduction, but her struggle, her pride, her despair. In these performances, Cleopatra ceased to be a caricature and became a woman again, flawed but compelling. It was William Shakespeare who gave her her most enduring voice. In Antony and Cleopatra, first performed around 1607, he transformed the Queen of Egypt into one of the most complex figures of his stage. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is witty, mercurial, passionate, and commanding. She taunts Antony, seduces him, enrages him, consoles him. She is not a simple temptress, but a woman of depth, capable of tenderness and cruelty, grandeur and pettiness, devotion and manipulation. Above all, she is alive, her language shimmering with vitality. Shakespeare did not portray her as villain, but as tragic heroine. Her love for Antony is both her strength and her undoing. Her pride leads to her fall, yet her death is a triumph, a choice that restores her dignity. In his hands, Cleopatra became more than propaganda, more than morality tale. She became human. Audiences of the Renaissance, steeped in the grandeur of Rome and the fascination with exotic lands, were captivated. Cleopatra's Egypt was imagined as a place of endless luxury, perfumed chambers, golden barges, feasts of wonder. Her story offered both escape and reflection. Escape into a world of romance and splendor, reflection on the dangers of ambition and desire. Yet even in this rebirth, contradictions remained. Cleopatra was admired and desired, but also feared. She was celebrated as a queen of passion, but her political genius was often overshadowed. The Renaissance loved her as a tragic muse, but rarely as a strategist. The Roman caricature softened, but it did not vanish entirely. Still, something vital had changed. Cleopatra was no longer only the villain of Augustus's tale. She was a heroine of art, a subject of drama, a figure who could inspire admiration as well as condemnation. Painters like Guido Reni and Artemisia Gentileschi depicted her with dignity and beauty. Poets gave her voice. Playwrights gave her stage. Through their hands, she crossed the threshold from history into myth, not as a monster, but as a woman of complexity. Imagine a theater in Elizabethan London, the stage lit by torches, the air thick with smoke, the crowd murmuring as Cleopatra enters. She speaks with wit, she weeps with grief, she dies with grandeur. The audience leans forward, enthralled. They know she is foreign, they know she is doomed, yet they cannot look away. They leave the playhouse not thinking of Octavian's triumph, but of Cleopatra's final words, her choice, her dignity. In this way, the Renaissance did what Rome could not. It gave Cleopatra back her humanity. She remained exotic, sensual, tragic, but she was no longer merely the corrupter of men. She was herself, a queen whose story echoed with power and passion across centuries. And so, by the time the 17th century dawned, Cleopatra was fixed not only in the annals of history, but in the fabric of art. She was at once the last pharaoh, the lover of Caesar and Antony, the temptress of Roman imagination, the sinner of medieval sermons, the muse of Renaissance painters, and the heroine of Shakespeare's stage. Few figures in history have been so many things to so many people. Few have endured with such vividness. What remains constant is this: Cleopatra compels. Whether condemned or celebrated, vilified or admired, she refuses to fade. She survived Roman propaganda, medieval morality, and Renaissance reinvention. Each age reshaped her, but none erased her. And in this constant rebirth, she reveals a truth that Augustus never intended: that legend is stronger than empire, and that memory is a crown no conqueror can take away. By the 17th century, Cleopatra had already stepped beyond history into legend. Shakespeare's voice still echoed across England. French dramatists staged her tale. Italian painters filled canvases with her image. But as Europe moved through the Baroque, the Enlightenment, and into the Romantic Age, Cleopatra's figure was reshaped yet again. No longer just a moral warning or tragic heroine, she became muse of painters, poets, and composers, a symbol of passion, grandeur, and the eternal allure of the Orient. Baroque artists reveled in her drama. The 17th century was an age of contrasts: light and shadow, ecstasy and despair, power and ruin, and Cleopatra embodied them all. Painters such as Guido Reni and Nicolas Poussin depicted her final moments with theatrical intensity. In their canvases, the queen reclined on couches of velvet, her skin luminous against the darkness, the asp poised at her breast. Attendants collapsed around her, golden vessels scattered, draperies swirling. To Baroque audiences, Cleopatra was spectacle incarnate, sensual beauty intertwined with tragic death. Opera, the new art form of the 17th century, embraced her story with equal fervor. Composers set her love affairs and her death to soaring arias and choruses. In Handel's Giulio Cesare in Egitto, 1724, Cleopatra was no mere seductress, but a queen of wit and charm, her music sparkling with vitality. The role became one of the great showcases of Baroque opera, demanding virtuosity, elegance, and emotional depth. Through song, Cleopatra was reborn as enchantress of melody, a figure who could disarm Caesar not only with beauty, but with voice. In the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, Cleopatra's story was filtered through reason and philosophy. Historians began to examine her reign more critically, though still through Roman lenses. Voltaire, fascinated by her, wrote of her as both dangerous and admirable. She was discussed in salons as an example of how passion and politics intertwine. Yet even as Enlightenment thinkers sought rational clarity, artists continued to revel in her drama. Paintings of Cleopatra's death adorned palaces and galleries, her story staged in tragedies across Europe. The Romantic era of the 19th century brought another transformation. Now, Cleopatra was not merely a figure of history or morality, but the embodiment of passion itself. Romantics, who exalted emotion over reason, found in her tale the perfect union of love, ruin, and grandeur. Poets such as Victor Hugo and Théophile Gautier wrote of her with fascination, portraying her as larger than life, a queen whose desires burned as brightly as her downfall. Painters of the Romantic age intensified her exoticism. Orientalism, the European fascination with the imagined East, swept through art and literature. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, became central to this vision. She was painted reclining in jeweled splendor, surrounded by silken curtains, incense, and attendants. Artists such as Jean-André Rixens and Alexandra Cabanel depicted her as the epitome of Oriental luxury, half-nude, draped in gold, awaiting the fatal asp. To European audiences, she represented both desire and danger, the allure of lands distant and mysterious. This Orientalist Cleopatra was less about Egypt itself and more about Europe's fantasies. She embodied the West's projection of the East as sensual, decadent, and fatal. In her, viewers saw a world of passion unbound by reason, a mirror for their own desires and fears. The historical Cleopatra, strategist and survivor, was once again overshadowed by myth. Yet this myth ensured her presence in galleries, salons, and theaters across the continent. The 19th century also brought archaeology into the story. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 sparked a wave of fascination with ancient monuments. The Rosetta Stone was discovered, hieroglyphs deciphered, temples documented. In this atmosphere, Cleopatra was seen not only as legend, but as historical figure, linked to the ruins rising from the sands. Writers and explorers sought her tomb, painters imagined her palaces. Tourists flocked to Alexandria, hoping to glimpse the world she once ruled. Meanwhile, in literature, she appeared in novels and epics. H. Rider Haggard's Cleopatra, 1889, blended romance with adventure, portraying her as a tragic queen caught between love and destiny. The Victorians, obsessed with morality yet entranced by passion, saw in her both a warning and an irresistible temptation. She was depicted as dangerously seductive, yet also noble in her final act of defiance. In England, Shakespeare's Cleopatra remained a staple of the stage, performed by great actresses of the era. Sarah Bernhardt in France and later Elizabeth Taylor in Hollywood would inherit this legacy. But in the 19th century, it was actresses like Helena Fawcett who brought her to life, embodying her complexity before audiences eager for grandeur and tragedy. Music, too, echoed with her name. Composers of the Romantic age set her story to symphonies and operas, drawn to the drama of her love and death. In 1877, Massenet composed Cleopatra, a work that captured both her sensuality and her grandeur. Through music, as through painting and poetry, she remained alive, her voice resonating across centuries. What unites all these depictions is the tension between history and imagination. The Cleopatra of the 19th century was not the queen who managed Egypt's grain supply, who spoke Egyptian, who maneuvered between Rome's factions. She was the Cleopatra of pearls and barges, of passion and poison, of beauty that conquered men and empires. This was the Cleopatra audiences wanted, a woman larger than life, a queen whose downfall confirmed the power of love and the inevitability of fate. And yet, beneath the embellishment, something true endured. In every painting of her death, in every aria sung in her name, in every novel that told her tale, there remained the image of a woman who refused submission. Even romantic Orientalism, for all its exaggeration, preserved her defiance. She may have been exoticized, eroticized, even distorted, but she was never diminished. She remained a queen. Imagine a Parisian gallery in the 1860s. Visitors stroll past canvases of saints and battles until they stop before a vast painting of Cleopatra's death. The queen lies in pale splendor, her breast exposed, the asp at her skin, attendants fainting around her. The air is heavy with perfume and death. The visitors murmur, entranced. They may not know the details of her reign, They may not care about Egyptian politics, but they feel the drama, the allure, the grandeur of a queen who chose her fate. Thus, by the dawn of the 20th century, Cleopatra was firmly embedded in Western imagination, not only as historical figure, but as eternal myth. She was at once the last pharaoh, the lover of Caesar and Antony, the sinner of sermons, the heroine of Shakespeare, the muse of romantic painters, the goddess of Orientalist fantasy. Few figures in history had been so often reshaped, so endlessly reinvented. And perhaps that is the truest measure of her power. Empires rose, kings and generals were forgotten, but Cleopatra endured. Each age found in her what it desired. Rome saw a villain, the Middle Ages a warning, the Renaissance a heroine, the Romantics a muse. In this constant transformation, she revealed the enduring human fascination with love, power, and the defiance of death. The 20th century was the age when Cleopatra truly became immortal in popular culture. For centuries, she had lived in scrolls and manuscripts, on canvases and stages, her legend shaped by poets, painters, and playwrights. But with the birth of cinema, her image reached a new audience, vast, global, immediate. No longer confined to elite salons or theaters, Cleopatra became a spectacle for millions, a queen who ruled not Egypt, but the silver screen. Hollywood was quick to recognize her potential. The Queen of Egypt, with her love affairs, her jewels, her dramatic death, was perfect material for film. Silent movies of the early 1900s embraced her as a subject of exotic grandeur. In 1912, the Italian production Cleopatra starred silent film icon Gianna Terribili Gonzalez, presenting the queen with elaborate costumes and stage-like sets. In 1917, American actress Theda Bara took up the mantle, her Cleopatra portrayed as the ultimate vamp, darkly seductive, dangerous, and decadent. Bara's costumes were provocative, her kohl-lined eyes blazing with allure, her movements exaggerated for the silent screen. To audiences, she was the embodiment of the femme fatale, the dangerous woman who destroyed men with desire. This image fit perfectly with the sensibilities of the early 20th century. At a time when society was grappling with changing roles for women, Cleopatra was a symbol of both fascination and fear. She was independent, powerful, sexual, a combination that thrilled and unsettled audiences. Theda Bara's film cemented Cleopatra as a cinematic archetype, though tragically, most of the film is now lost, destroyed in a fire. Only fragments and photographs survive, tantalizing glimpses of the Cleopatra who once commanded early Hollywood. In the decades that followed, other films tried their hand at her story, each shaping her image for its time. Claudette Colbert played Cleopatra in 1934 in a lavish Cecil B. DeMille production. Colbert's queen was glamorous, witty, and playful, her costumes dazzling, her sets dripping with luxury. The film, made in the midst of the Great Depression, offered audiences escape into a world of gold and marble, a fantasy of excess at a time of scarcity. Colbert's Cleopatra was not only seductive but intelligent, her wit sparring with Caesar and Antony alike. In her, viewers saw both allure and sharpness, a step closer to the historical queen's intellect. But it was Elizabeth Taylor in 1963 who sealed Cleopatra's place in cinematic history. The film Cleopatra, one of the most expensive ever made, became legend in its own right. Taylor's Cleopatra was radiant, tempestuous, commanding. Her entrance into Rome on a golden barge, dressed in shimmering robes, surrounded by slaves and jewels, remains one of the most iconic scenes in film history. The production was plagued by scandal, with Taylor's real-life romance with Richard Burton, her Antony, mirroring the passion of their characters. Newspapers around the world buzzed with gossip, blurring the line between history and Hollywood drama. The film nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox, but it also immortalized Cleopatra as a global icon. For millions, Elizabeth Taylor's face became the face of Cleopatra. Her costumes, lavish headdresses, sequined gowns, eye makeup drawn in sharp Egyptian lines influenced fashion. Women imitated her style, magazines featured her image, and the Cleopatra look became part of 20th century glamour. The historical queen was once again transformed, this time into a star of modern mythology. Beyond film, Cleopatra thrived in literature and scholarship. The 20th century saw new archaeological discoveries in Egypt, renewed interest in Alexandria, and deeper study of her reign. Historians began to challenge the Roman propaganda, presenting Cleopatra as more than a seductress. Works by scholars such as Stacy Schiff in later decades would highlight her political acumen, her survival skills, and her role as a ruler, not merely a lover. Yet for popular imagination, Hollywood's vision often overshadowed academic revision. The stage, too, kept her alive. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra was performed countless times, each actress bringing her own interpretation. Some emphasized her sensuality, others her wit, still others her regal authority. In the hands of great performers, Cleopatra was endlessly versatile, a role that demanded not only beauty, but intelligence, charisma, and emotional depth. As the 20th century moved forward, Cleopatra's image was embraced by new cultural movements. Feminist writers reclaimed her as a symbol of female power, arguing that her vilification was the product of misogyny and imperial propaganda. They pointed out that she had ruled Egypt for 2 decades, navigated impossible politics, and faced Rome's greatest leaders with courage. For them, Cleopatra was not a femme fatale, but a survivor, a strategist, a queen who defied the limitations placed on women. At the same time, popular culture continued to revel in her glamour. She appeared in comic books, advertisements, even fashion campaigns. Perfumes bore her name, jewelry lines claimed inspiration from her treasures, singers referenced her in lyrics. She became shorthand for seduction and majesty, invoked whenever a touch of exotic luxury was desired. What is remarkable is how flexible her image proved to be. For some, she was the dangerous temptress. For others, the tragic heroine. For still others, the feminist icon. Each generation shaped her anew, and she seemed to fit every mold. Unlike other figures of antiquity, fixed in stone, Cleopatra was fluid, malleable, alive in imagination. Consider the cultural context of the 1960s. The Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra premiered in a decade of upheaval, of shifting gender roles, of fascination with spectacle. The film's grandeur mirrored the optimism and extravagance of its age, while Taylor herself embodied the growing power of women in public life. Her Cleopatra was sensual, but also authoritative, her gaze direct, her words sharp. She was not merely Antony's lover, but his equal, sometimes even his superior. For audiences, this was both thrilling and controversial, reflecting their own debates about women's roles in society. By the late 20th century, Cleopatra had become more than a historical queen. She was an archetype. She appeared in art as a muse, in politics as a metaphor, in fashion as a style, in scholarship as a subject of debate. Museums displayed coins bearing her profile, statues that might have been hers, artifacts from her reign. Tourists flocked to Alexandria and to Egyptian ruins, imagining her world, searching for traces of the queen who had captured the imagination of millennia. And yet, for all the movies, plays, novels, and artworks, the real Cleopatra remained elusive. Her tomb has never been found. Her body never recovered. Her face, known only from coins and statues, is still debated. Some see beauty, others sharp features, intelligence etched into her gaze. This mystery only adds to her allure. She is present everywhere and nowhere, shaped endlessly by imagination, because the truth remains partly hidden. The 20th century proved that Cleopatra was not bound by time or culture. From silent films to Hollywood epics, from feminist essays to pop songs, she moved fluidly through art and memory. She was ancient and modern, Egyptian and Roman, queen and myth. Few figures in history have enjoyed such longevity, such adaptability. As the century ended, Cleopatra stood not only as the last pharaoh, but as an icon of popular culture, her story known across continents, her image recognized by millions who may never have opened a history book. In life, she fought for survival against Rome. In death, she conquered the world's imagination. The 21st century brought Cleopatra into a new age of interpretation. If the Romans had vilified her, the Middle Ages had moralized her, and the Renaissance and Romantic Ages had romanticized her, then our own time has sought to deconstruct her. In the world of the 21st century, globalized, diverse, questioning of old hierarchies, Cleopatra has become a prism through which debates about race, gender, power, and history itself are refracted. She is no longer only the Queen of Egypt. She is a global icon, claimed and contested by many, her story retold in countless ways. One of the most striking aspects of Cleopatra's 21st century life is how she has been reinterpreted through feminism. For generations, the dominant narrative painted her as a seductress, a woman who wielded sexuality as her only weapon. But scholars and writers today argue that this is itself a reflection of misogyny, inherited from Roman propaganda and repeated for centuries. In truth, Cleopatra ruled Egypt for more than 2 decades, navigated alliances with the most powerful man of her time, maintained Egypt's independence longer than might have been expected, and fostered learning, culture, and religion. She was not merely a lover of Caesar and Antony. She was a monarch in her own right, exercising agency in a world stacked against her. Books like Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra, A Life, 2010, have reshaped public perception, portraying her as brilliant, multilingual, politically astute, and deeply strategic. Schiff dismantles the clichés of Cleopatra as temptress, showing her instead as a woman who had to maneuver in a ruthless world dominated by men, a survivor who refused to be erased. This perspective has resonated strongly in an age more attuned to the voices of women silenced by history. Cleopatra has also become central to conversations about race and representation. For centuries, her image was shaped by European artists who painted her as pale-skinned, often in ways that reflected their own ideals of beauty rather than historical reality. In the 21st century, debates over her ancestry have ignited passionate discussion. Was she Greek, descended purely from Macedonian Ptolemies? Was her mother perhaps Egyptian, or from another lineage that connected her to Africa? The absence of definitive evidence has allowed speculation to flourish. But what matters more is what the debate reveals. Cleopatra has become a symbol of identity, of ownership of the past. For African and Middle Eastern communities, she represents a heritage too often claimed only by Europe. For Western audiences, she challenges assumptions about who gets to embody history's most famous queen. These debates reached a fever pitch with modern media portrayals. When Netflix released a docudrama series in 2023 casting a black actress as Cleopatra, reactions were polarized. Some celebrated the choice as reclaiming Cleopatra for Africa, breaking with centuries of Eurocentric depictions. Others criticized it as historically inaccurate, insisting on her Macedonian Greek heritage. The controversy itself was telling. Cleopatra, dead for 2,000 years, still stirs fierce emotions about identity, representation, and truth. She is not just a figure of antiquity, she is a battlefield for modern cultural politics. In cinema, Cleopatra remains a tantalizing subject. Rumors swirl of new films, some envisioning her as a feminist heroine, others as a political mastermind. Actresses from Angelina Jolie to Gal Gadot have been linked to projects about her, each sparking debates about casting, heritage, and authenticity. The very question of who should play Cleopatra reveals how alive her story remains. Unlike so many figures of the past, she is not settled, not finished, but continuously reinvented. In literature, she has appeared in novels that imagine her voice, her thoughts, her inner life. Writers strive to restore her humanity, to hear her not as Roman enemies described her, but as she might have spoken for herself. In these stories, she emerges not only as queen, but as mother, daughter, lover, strategist. She is no longer a one-dimensional temptress, but a complex figure, flawed and brilliant, vulnerable and indomitable. Art in the 21st century also embraces her in new ways. Installations, sculptures, and paintings reimagine her with modern aesthetics, blending ancient motifs with contemporary symbolism. Some depict her in futuristic forms, as though projecting her legend into eternity. Others strip away the jewels and luxuries to show a woman of flesh and blood, reclaiming her from centuries of exotic fantasy. Museums mount exhibitions exploring not only her reign, but the myth of Cleopatra, inviting visitors to question how history is told and who controls its narratives. Cleopatra has also become a symbol in broader cultural discourse. Politicians, activists, and writers invoke her name as shorthand for female power, for resistance against domination, for the complexity of women in leadership. She is quoted in speeches, referenced in songs, celebrated in fashion. Her image, lined eyes, cobra crown, regal poise, appears on runways, in advertisements, in digital art. In an age when icons are endlessly recycled, Cleopatra endures, instantly recognizable even to those who know little of her actual life. What makes her especially powerful in the 21st century is the tension between myth and reality. On one hand, we now know more than ever about her historical context, the political situation of Egypt, the pressures of Rome, the realities of her reign. On the other hand, the myths, pearls dissolved in wine, the asp in the basket of figs, the barge with purple sails, remain irresistible. The line between history and legend is blurred, and perhaps that is why she continues to fascinate. She exists both as fact and as fantasy, both as woman and as myth. In this sense, Cleopatra embodies the very spirit of our time, a world wrestling with truth and narrative, with identity and myth-making. We live in an era of contested stories, where history is constantly re-examined, where voices once silenced demand to be heard. Cleopatra is the perfect figure for such an age, for her story has always been contested, shaped, and reshaped. She is less a fixed person than a mirror reflecting the desires, fears, and dreams of those who tell her tale. Consider this. 2,000 years after her death, Cleopatra is still the subject of arguments in newspapers, classrooms, and social media. Her ancestry, her lovers, her strategies, her death, every detail is debated, interpreted, reimagined. Few figures in antiquity command such attention. Caesar and Antony are remembered, yes, but they do not ignite the same fire. Cleopatra does, because she is not only history but symbol, not only queen but myth. And perhaps this is her greatest victory. Octavian sought to erase her, to reduce her to a villain in his story. Instead, she has outlived him in cultural memory. Augustus built an empire, but Cleopatra built a legend. Empires crumble, but legends endure. In the 21st century, her legend is stronger than ever. Imagine a young woman today, in Cairo, in London, in New York, scrolling through images on her phone. She sees Cleopatra in a Renaissance painting, in a Hollywood film, in a feminist essay, in a meme. Each version is different, each shaped by context, but all share the same core: a queen who refused to submit, who chose her own fate, who remains unforgettable. That young woman may feel in Cleopatra not just history but kinship, a reminder that women have always sought power, love, and dignity, even in a world that tried to deny them. Thus, Cleopatra in the 21st century is not merely a relic of the past. She is alive in our debates, our art, our imagination. She is claimed by Egypt, by Africa, by women, by feminists, by filmmakers, by fashion designers. She belongs to no one and to everyone. And in that universal embrace, she reveals the truth of her immortality. Cleopatra's life ended in the sealed chamber of her mausoleum in Alexandria, but her story never truly ended. For more than 2,000 years, she has haunted the imagination of the world, appearing in chronicles and sermons, paintings and plays, operas and films, novels and debates. Few figures in history have been so persistently reimagined, so endlessly contested, so deeply embedded in the human imagination. Her diadem may have fallen, but her crown is memory itself, and that crown has never slipped from her brow. What then is Cleopatra's true legacy? To answer that, we must return to the woman herself, stripped of centuries of myth. Historically, Cleopatra VII Philopator was the last sovereign ruler of Egypt, reigning from 51 to 30 before Christ. She inherited a kingdom weakened by internal strife and external pressures, a land coveted by Rome, its independence hanging by a thread. She ruled for more than 20 years, longer than most of her Ptolemaic ancestors, through cunning, resilience, and adaptability. She spoke the language of her people, identified herself with their gods, and maneuvered among the most powerful men of her age, Caesar, Antony, Octavian, with skill. This alone is remarkable. In a world dominated by men, in an era when women were rarely allowed public power, Cleopatra stood as queen in her own right, commanding armies, negotiating alliances, governing a nation. She was not merely the lover of powerful men, she was their political partner, their rival, sometimes their superior. Her reign testifies to her intelligence and tenacity, qualities often obscured by the myths woven around her. But history is not only facts, it is also stories. And Cleopatra's story became inseparable from legend almost as soon as she died. The Romans needed her to be villain. The Middle Ages needed her to be warning. The Renaissance needed her to be muse. The Romantics needed her to be passion, and the modern world needs her to be symbol. Each age reshaped her, but in doing so, each ensured her survival. It is this fusion of fact and myth that makes her enduring. If she were remembered only as the last ruler of Egypt, her name might be a footnote in the Chronicles of Rome. If she were remembered only as a seductress, her image might have faded with changing morals. But she is remembered as both, and as more. She is queen and lover, strategist and temptress, goddess and woman, villain and heroine. She is contradiction embodied, and contradictions live longer than certainties. Her diadem rests in the imagination of every culture that has claimed her. For Egyptians, she is the last pharaoh, the woman who defended their land until the end, the embodiment of Isis who chose her fate. For the West, she has been temptress and muse, her beauty the stuff of paintings and plays. For feminists, she is a symbol of resilience against a male-dominated world, her vilification proof of the ways women's power has been feared and distorted. For African and Middle Eastern voices, she is heritage reclaimed, a queen of their soil too long appropriated by others. This universality is part of her immortality. Cleopatra belongs to no one alone. She belongs to all who see in her a reflection of their own struggles, desires, and dreams. In this, she transcends history and becomes archetype. And yet, even as myth, she continues to provoke questions. What did she truly look like? Coins show a strong profile, a prominent nose, sharp features, different from the soft beauty painted by Renaissance artists or embodied by Elizabeth Taylor. Was she Greek, Macedonian, Egyptian, mixed? Did she die by the bite of an asp, by poison, by dagger? Was she driven by passion or by strategy, or both? These uncertainties fuel her legend. They make her not a closed book, but an open riddle, one the world is forever trying to solve. Archaeology may yet add to her story. For decades, explorers have searched for her tomb, rumored to lie near Alexandria or perhaps at Taposiris Magna. Each discovery, coins, statues, inscriptions, rekindles fascination. To find her burial place would be one of the greatest finds in history, yet part of her power lies in its absence. Cleopatra's body remains lost, and so she remains unbound, free to live in imagination rather than in stone. Her influence in culture today is everywhere. She appears in novels that give her voice, in films that dramatize her romances, in scholarly works that reclaim her intellect, in art that reimagines her image. She is invoked in songs, from pop to hip-hop, as shorthand for power and allure. Her likeness appears on fashion runways, her name on perfumes and jewelry. Even digital media, memes, and online debates cannot resist her pull. Cleopatra has become not only Queen of Egypt, but Queen of cultural reinvention. What explains this endless fascination? Perhaps it is the combination of love and power, of politics and passion. Cleopatra's story is not merely about conquest or governance, it is about the human heart entangled with ambition. She loved Caesar and Antony, but she also maneuvered through them, using intimacy as strategy. Her downfall was entwined with her affections, but also with the relentless tide of empire. In her, the personal and the political are inseparable. That is why she captivates, because she embodies both the grandeur of history and the intimacy of emotion. She also captivates because she defied expectations. To the Romans, she was a woman who dared to rule. To the Middle Ages, she was a queen who dared to desire. To the modern world, she is a figure who dared to survive in defiance of fate. Her choices, whether celebrated or condemned, were her own. Even in death, she denied Octavian his triumph, choosing her own end rather than submitting to chains. In this act, she became immortal. Cleopatra's diadem glitters not in stone, but in memory. She is remembered not because she ruled Egypt at its fall, but because she gave that fall meaning. She is remembered not because she lost to Rome, but because she refused to be erased by Rome's victory. She is remembered not because she was perfect, but because she was complex, human, divine, strategic, passionate, flawed, brilliant. If we listen closely, we can almost hear her voice, echoing across centuries. Not the voice Romans mocked, but the voice Plutarch admired. Eloquent, musical, persuasive. It is the voice of a queen who spoke Egyptian to her people, Greek to her court, Latin to her Roman lovers. It is the voice of a woman who straddled worlds, who lived at the crossroads of civilizations, who understood that to survive one must adapt, charm, fight, and endure. 2,000 years later, Cleopatra still speaks. She speaks through Shakespeare's lines, through Taylor's gaze, through Schiff's pages, through paintings and songs and arguments on social media. She speaks whenever a woman claims her right to power, whenever history is re-examined through new eyes, whenever myth is questioned but never forgotten. And so, as we close this long journey through her life and legend, let us remember not only the Cleopatra of Rome's propaganda or Hollywood spectacle, but the Cleopatra who was queen, a ruler who loved her people, who fought for her throne, who carved her name into eternity with wit and will. She was the last pharaoh, but also the first in another sense. The first woman whose story has traveled across millennia, reinvented in every age, alive in every telling. Empires fall, monuments crumble, names fade. But Cleopatra endures. She is Isis and queen, temptress and strategist, sinner and saint, victim and victor. She is contradiction incarnate. And that is why she lives. The Nile still flows. The pyramids still stand. The desert still whispers with memory. And somewhere in that timeless landscape, Cleopatra's spirit lingers. Not in chains, not in silence, but in story. For as long as we tell stories, she will never die.